Welcome everyone to another exciting week with our weekly Twitter spaces that we put together. This is the Mission Matters. We are a media platform focused on the needs of entrepreneurs, executives, experts. Every week we put together a dialogue. This week's episode is super special. It's an interview with one of Facebook's first advisors, Karl Jacob, a serial entrepreneur and also an avid investor, angel investor, and investor in general across the board on the venture side. Can share a lot of his tips, tools, secrets, and also just his story is just incredible as well. And so with that, I'm going to pass it here to Adam in just a moment. But just so everyone is familiar with Karl Jacob is a serial entrepreneur who's been building, advising, and investing in companies for the last 20 years. During his career, Karl has raised 23 rounds of financing from a wide range of investors, including True Ventures, Baseline Ventures, Richard Branson's Virgin Group, Microsoft, eBay, Integral Partners, Norwest Ventures, Greylock, Benchmark, FT Ventures, Ignition Partners, and Vulcan Ventures. Many of Karl's companies have successfully been acquired, including DimensionX, acquired by Microsoft, Key Ingenio, which was acquired by AT&T, Cloudmark, which was acquired by Proofpoint, and Coveroo, which was acquired by Zazzle. Across his various tenures as a startup CEO, Karl has generated hundreds of millions of dollars in investor returns and up to 150 million in revenue per year. In 2005, he joined Facebook as one of its first advisors and has gone on to advise several other companies. Karl has a prolific angel investor background and also is a mentor for startup companies including Maven, June, HealthTap, Everlane, Skillshare, Rescale, Haven, Shippo, and many others. He holds a bachelor's in computer science from USC's engineering school, where he sits on its advised board of counselors. Fight on, may I add, because I went to USC as well, so got to throw that out there. With that, why don't we pass it off to Adam to start the dialogue?
All right. Thank you, Chirag. And I knew you were going to work in a fight on for sure. Oh, have to. It's great. So as Chirag mentioned, so I have, a series of questions to get us started and kicked off here that are just on my mind and looking into Karl's background. And then we'll definitely open it up so others can ask Mr. Karl as well. So I will not be hogging the mic today. So just to get us kicked off, Karl, and looking at your background, I mean, you've been doing this a long time. You've generated a lot of revenue for investors, a lot of shareholder value. But I'm curious if we could maybe go back to maybe the early days, if that's where it began. Like, how did you know if there was a point or a progression or what? Like, how did you know, like, entrepreneurship was for you? Like, how did you know that was going to be your path?
Oh, that's a really great question. And one I actually thought about a lot lately. I started out really early as a kid, actually experimenting around with stuff. So I love just trying new things. My dad used to take me to the car dealership and got the mechanic to hand me a box of car parts that I would assemble in different ways and try to build things. So I think, that carried into my career. I worked at Apple and then I worked at Sun. And I remember exactly the moment where I needed to become an entrepreneur. And I built a product at Sun and it was competitive with another product at Sun. And met Scott McNeely, who was the CEO at the time. And he said, "Well, why isn't this shipping?" And I said, "Well, I can't get anybody to listen to me. I'm frustrated and everybody tells me no." And he turned to me and he says, "Karl, to ask is to seek denial." And I went home and I thought about that for quite a while. And the answer that I came up with is I don't think one that Scott thought I would, which is I left about 2 weeks later to start another company. And I realized that wasn't going to happen at a big company. I wasn't going to be able to do the things that I wanted to do easily and follow my dream. And my mom, actually, I told her on the phone that I'd quit and was going to go do a startup, and she cried. So it was not a popular decision at the time, but I knew that was my path. And I got a lot of reminders in my career after that, particularly being acquired by other large companies, that my path is the startup path and the entrepreneur path.
And so now I want to stick a little bit longer in the younger years for a moment. But so now you have this, you know you're going to be an entrepreneur. You're out there, let's say, with your first venture, your first ventures, whatever. Like what does that path look like for you? Because it was obvious. I'm guessing it was pretty different than what your corporate experience had been prior. Or am I off on that?
I mean, I think the groups that I was a part of at Apple and at Sun were essentially entrepreneurial as you could be in large companies. It's funny. I was watching the Steve Jobs thing the other night, and Andy Hertzfeld was actually somebody I interacted with when I was at Apple. So I felt very lucky to be those teams. And at Sun, I worked on the news team that eventually became the Java team. So pretty entrepreneurial there. But I think the big thing was just there's no safety net. That is a big recognition that you have when you strike off on your own. My first company, we actually started it out of my apartment in San Francisco. We didn't have offices. We didn't have anything really. We had servers that actually were in my apartment, but other than that, it was very much from the ground up. And I think there's a lot of also learning as you go. I would basically try to be a CEO during the day and I would code at night, which made for some pretty long days and nights. But that's what you have to do in those early days, but particularly if it's your first one. You
Mhm.
kind of do whatever you can to get off the ground.
Anything that you remember that you even maybe use today from those early days in terms of keeping your team motivated or together, or like getting like selling the vision, right? You got the servers in your apartment, you got a bit of selling the vision there to do, right? Whether it's with vendors or otherwise, right?
Yeah, I mean it's changed a lot, right? There wasn't an ecosystem nearly as mature as it is now for supporting entrepreneurs and startups. There was no YC, there were very few angel investors. Ron Conway actually was my first angel investor, if that tells you anything. And I think it was one of his first investments. So all kidding aside, you can't sleep underneath a desk, which I guess is a skill that you learn early on as an entrepreneur. You know, I think it's really thinking deeply about the mission of the company and what you're trying to do for your customers. I know that's kind of a well-worn path these days, and everybody's like, "Oh, I want to go to a mission-driven company or whatever." But I found out early in my career that if you focus on the needs of the customer and delivering value to them, that gets people excited. At Dimension X, it sounds crazy, but there wasn't really any much animation on the web. It was really kind of a dead, flat space. And we invented a whole bunch of tools in order to really animate the web and make it more interactive. And our mission was really to bring this a massive amount of creativity that was swirling around in the world to the internet in a new and different way. And that really captured a lot of the excitement and the imagination of the people that we worked with. I remember distinctly one of my hardest recruiting moments was I recruited my first admin, and her parents were very concerned that she was going to go work for a startup. She agreed to have lunch with me, and about 15 minutes into the interview, she admitted that her parents were two tables away, making sure everything went okay. So that was a lot of pressure. She turned out to actually be an incredible employee and then a salesperson who just, was one of the things we tested for at that time, and I still do, is curiosity and willingness to learn. She asked me one day if she could do something more. And I said, well, you could sell. We need salespeople. And she says, well, how do I do that? I'm like, well, here's a bunch of books. And she went and figured it out, which is awesome to see. So I think as a CEO and a founder, you're always selling the vision. You're always adapting the vision in many ways. But I think if you get to the core of it, as long as it stems from a deep need to help people and improve their lives, it's hard to go wrong. When you branch off of that and it's all about making money or selling the company or
Mhm.
whatever, those problems usually can trace them back to a mission that wasn't aligned with some benefit to humanity or people.
Yeah. So, just to date this, because this will be recorded and distributed for a long time to come. So we're, going into 2023, or I should say this is November of 2022. A lot going on, a lot of things in the headlines, right? Certain companies laying off workers, and maybe there's some displacement and coming off of COVID. Just a lot of things going on. A lot of people are pivoting. Some people are thinking about, maybe their business didn't work, so thinking of something else or a pivot. Maybe some people are, considering moving from corporate to entrepreneurship. In general, what are some of the things, like, as somebody's in today's business environment, entrepreneurial environment, what are some of the things that should be on the minds of entrepreneurs that are really considering just the overall business climate? What are some things they should be thinking about?
Well, it's interesting. There was a Twitter thread where somebody was saying, I think that now is the time all these people are going to start companies. And my comment was, well, no, this is when they flee to safety. So usually people, from big companies come to the startup space at the top of the bubble,
Mm,
right? At the absolute peak, because the pressure just becomes too much. And we saw that. We saw that in 99, 2000. We saw it just recently. And that's usually my indication when people are leaving their high end corporate jobs and the safety to go to a startup. It's just a very different type of personality. And I think it's important to remember that startups are not for everyone, and entrepreneurship is not for everyone. And I know that's not a very popular opinion. It's just not. It's hard. It's brutal. I just talked to my company today about this is no longer peacetime. This is wartime for companies. And so I think that many great companies will be built now. Many great companies will survive this, meaning if you look at 99 2000, the ones that survived it, including our company during that time, were thriving on the other side because everything becomes cheaper. People, marketing, real estate, everything. So you build a company on a foundation of reasonable costs.
Mm.
If you built a company over the last almost 10 years, it was built on top of these unsustainable systems. Everybody was too expensive. Buildings were too expensive. Services were too expensive. Advertising was too expensive. And when you do that, you kind of have to build a company that's 10 times more profitable than you would in an environment like we're entering into or we're in right now. So I think conserve every dollar, treat it like this is the norm. This is the norm. Tough is the norm. What we had the last 10 years or so was not the norm. That was the blip or the glitch in the matrix, so to speak. People tend to look at it the other way, like, oh well, it's another crash and that's just going to happen, and that's true, but that's the reality of these times and economies. You're going to hit hard times. Bob Cagle at Benchmark used to have a great quote. He said, every great company has to have at least one crisis.
Hmm.
eBay was his example of that, and they had a crisis when they were hiring Meg right before everything fell apart.
Hmm.
And they had a terrible quarter. They missed their numbers, and she actually backed out of the CEO job. And they tell a great story of how that like forced the company to be much more rigorous, much more focused, like it's doing to a lot of companies right now. So I think if you're going to start now, it's a great time to start, and you can hire great talent that are entrepreneurial themselves, that are going to put in the extra effort, are going to, you know, just to be honest, grind. Like it's tough. It's not easy. It is not a 9 to 5 job. And the idea that there's no such thing as a 9 to 5 startup job in my
Right.
my estimation. That's a lie that people told, and it's just I don't find that to be true. Later on during peacetime, sure, there are times when it can be a 9 to 5 job. Certainly not in the early days, and certainly not during wartime, which is what we're in now.
Yeah, on our shows, I think that rings true. Whether it's on our podcast network and our hosts that are hosting shows on that, and one thing that normally comes through on the Mission Matters platform overall is the truth when it comes to entrepreneurship. And what you're saying, it definitely rings true across shows. I want to jump around a little bit here, Karl. So, I mean, over 20 rounds of financing raised, companies, of course, raising capital in today's business environment. Like, does anything change? Like, what should people be doing?
Oh, yeah, it changes almost completely. I think the two pieces of advice I talk to a lot of the mentees or people I'm mentoring about are really one, you have to be a lot more selective about who you talk to,
Mm.
because about 50% or more of the people who say they're putting money to work are not.
Mm.
And you have to understand like the dynamics of a venture capital firm or investor. In order to make your limited partners, your investors feel good, you have to show activity. And activity is looking at deals. That doesn't mean you
Mm.
do the deals, but you have to show you're doing something for that carry that you're charging them. And so they will see deals, they just won't do them. And
Mm.
so the first is to really stay focused on this idea that like don't go talking to everybody like you could before when everybody's flush with cash and
Yeah.
decisions are quick and easy. That's really the first, is be selective. The second is be ready for a long protracted funding cycle,
Mm.
because now they are not going to be criticized for taking an extra couple weeks
Yeah.
or doing a little bit more due diligence, as we're starting to see with the whole FTX thing. That's one of those things where just if you thought it was going to take you 30 days to close a financing, it's going to take you 60 or 90.
Mm.
And You'll also, I guess I'm going to add a third one. The third is people will behave in ways they would have never before. They'll pull term sheets. They will ask for ridiculous terms. They will grind valuation down as much as they possibly can, even more so than they would in the past. And they will look for every reason to say no. And so you have to be super cognizant of timing. If you're not ready to raise, if the numbers don't look good, if you're not growing and or headed to profitability, and I would recommend headed toward profitability, then you should consider not raising if you can last a little bit longer and get your act together on those fronts.
You get asked this question many times when you're speaking, but I mean, everybody's seen the movie at this point, I'm guessing, The Social Network. So just jumping around a little bit here, how accurate is it? Like, well, tell us a little bit more about your experiences.
That is
you knew it was coming up, Crowd.
Oh, of course. Well,
and I didn't ask that question.
You bet. And I'll tell the whole story because it's a pretty good one. Well, a couple different things. The Social Network is a great movie. It's a great piece of film work. It's just not true. I mean, that's just the bottom line. They did a great job telling a story. The story was written mostly by people who were not at Facebook or who left early. And so imagine the story of any company being told by the founders who left or were fired, and you're going to get a very different picture than when it's told by the people who stayed and built the company. I'll give you an example of like how far off the movie is. Right. So there's a scene in the movie where Sean basically is partying in Hollywood and doing drugs and gets caught. Right. It sounds like a typical thing that would happen in Hollywood. Well, here's the thing. It didn't happen in Hollywood. And Sean wasn't caught with drugs. It happened in Hatteras, North Carolina. I know because I was the person who rented the house that he took over, and I made him take over the lease. And so this whole story that they told that became the truth because myself and others at Facebook weren't interested in being interviewed for the movie, now what people think really happened. Good example of that too is perfect example of that is, that Mark was quite callous when it came to Eduardo and that whole situation, and he was not. Mark was wrecked over that situation. It's a really hard thing to do, and they make it look like he just could have cared less, and there's nothing further from the truth. It was, very, very difficult for him and the rest of us, right? And so, good movie, good story. I remember David when he wanted to interview me for the book and then for the movie, and I turned him down. And I just said, it's not my story to tell. If the guys want to tell the story, it's their story. My job was to be a mentor, an advisor, and to be a safe place for them to come and talk. And there's no way I'm telling that story to anybody, really. That'll go with me because at the end of the day, that's my job. My job is to be there for them in the darkest of hours and be the safe place that they can go, that they know it'll never go anywhere, even the really bad stuff.
Yeah. Awesome. And all right, we checked that box. That had to come up, Carl. All right. So I do want to bring us present day. So obviously lots of years of experience. You already talked about your background, a lot of different things you can do. You obviously see a value in the space you're in and you decide to co-found Snap. Like what attracted you to this industry and to the market?
This is the one where I took advice from Bill Campbell, who was an amazing mentor and was somebody that I spent time with at Benchmark. He said, sometimes serendipity needs time to work. And in this case, I kind of took my own advice. I'd always told entrepreneurs, look for big industries that are broken and go fix them. And out of the blue, a friend of mine said, hey, would you come have dinner with me? I have a mortgage company and I need help. And so I went to dinner with him and I said, I got to be honest, I don't know anything about mortgage. And I didn't. I mean, I had a couple, right? Yeah. And he walked me through it and I started doing some investigation and realized it's a $13 trillion industry. And a third of the federal balance sheet of the United States of America is backed by mortgages. It's just mind-blowing. That's why 2008 was such a big deal. It is the underpinning of finances. Basically, you make money in stocks and you keep money in mortgage or treasuries or bonds or whatever you want to look at those instruments as. Debt is how you keep your money and grow it through tough times like we're in right now. So that was the first checkoff item, was like huge market. Second one was I couldn't figure out why somebody hadn't done this before and fixed it. I mean, it was
Mm.
so big. And then you realize that that's why, because there was so much money being made by so many different people in the space that there was no reason. The profit margins were humongous. Think about this. So you put your money in a bank, and that bank basically gives you, let's say, 0.5% in your savings account.
Mm-hmm.
They take that money and they lend it out at 3 to 4%. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that there's a lot of money being made there and it's not going to the customer. And there's
Yeah.
a lot of room to fix that. So those two things coupled together, kind of this massive industry and huge waste everywhere we looked, spelled a big opportunity. Now, honestly, I had no idea how hard it was going to be. I thought, oh, I've done a bunch of these. We'll do some cool technology, and this can't be that hard a problem to solve.
Yeah.
Well, here I am 5 years later, and we're still working on it. And we've closed mortgages in 24 hours, and we're double the profitability of anybody in our space, and we still have work to do. So, there's a reason that software hasn't eaten the world, and this
Mm-hmm.
is the Mark Andreessen thing. It's like, well, software is going to eat the world, just not at the same rate everywhere. And mortgages has taken us a considerable amount of time and effort.
Yeah, and like just historically, a lot of the large industries like that, finance, it's kind of hard to move it, right? Whether it's the infrastructure that's already there or the obviously educating clientele. I'm just off your website, it says smart loan process saved our customers over 80 million last year alone. And again, that's directly from the website. Maybe give us just a little bit more about like what the smart loan process entails, like the user experience.
Yeah, it's something I really love talking about because we actually, I like to talk about the lies people tell you when you're an entrepreneur.
Mm,
And every company has a story like that. Like people will lie to you, and they're not trying to lie to you.
yeah.
And so, take it to Apple and the iPod, right? The lie was, well, there's no way that people want more than 6 or 7 songs in their cassette tape player, right? That
Right.
was the lie. Well, of course they did. They just didn't think it was possible. Well,
Mm-hmm.
in finance, the lie is that, well, if we just educated people, they'd make better decisions. If we just taught finance in high school, well, we found that not to be true. What we found was that people are busy and they have lives and jobs and demands of their time. The last thing they want to do at night when they come home from working their job is sit in front of a computer with a spreadsheet and try to figure out their finances. It's
Yeah.
just the truth. And so we can say we should educate people all we want, but what people really want are simple financial tools that solve those problems for them and give them the facts. They want a trusted resource. They don't want to know how the Uber got to them. They want the Uber to get to them and take them somewhere else. They don't
Mm,
want to know how the engine works. They don't want to know, the route that they drove. They just want the service. And I think in finance it's the same thing. They just want to know, how much money can I save,
mm-hmm.
in plain and simple terms. And so we turned that whole thing on its head and said, well, look, we're not going to focus on education. We're going to focus on pulling all the data that we need and building a financial model for the consumer in real time. That was really the unlock, the thing that made a difference. And so once you start thinking about it from that perspective, and your mission becomes saving people money and
Mm-hmm.
not charging them a high interest rate or not making what banks and other people are making, then it changes the way you think about the product and the value. And the lie that has been told is like, oh, we just need to educate people. No, we just need to give them better tools so that, they don't have to have a financial background in order to get a mortgage. You shouldn't need one. You
Yeah.
should be plain and simple English terms and things I can understand. Like, I'm saving $200 a month and here's how I'm saving it versus,
Yeah.
a bunch of gobbledygook.
When I first kind of dug into the website in preparing this and seeing this, I mean, you took me back to, I mean, when my first job out of college, I worked for a mortgage company, and I remember doing the like literally doing the math by
Yep.
hand and like educating somebody over the phone. I mean, this is a while ago, right? So this is pre 2008. And I remember doing all that. And when I looked at this, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, like this, it just makes so much sense. And, especially like just making it so accessible to people, like allowing them to be able to go through this and not have to work with somebody that's their profession, that's all they do all day long, so that they can get the knowledge, so that they can make an educated decision at the end of the day. So I mean, I think it's a home run. I'm curious about just the overall industry. Do you see more of the industry going in this direction?
I think they'll try. I think
Mm.
it's a lot harder than it looks. We did the first part of this, which we just kind of talked through
Mm-hmm.
almost 5 years ago, and we thought, wow, people are going to follow us so fast. And of course, that's the fear a startup has, is like, oh, everybody's going to do this. Well, really, nobody did it.
Mm-hmm.
And then nobody followed through. So that system that we built back then now powers this whole underwriting back end system that radically reduces the amount of work that needs to be done and automates most of it. So that system is basically an AI system that sits on top of all this data and can originate a mortgage in 24 hours. I mean, that's just
Yeah,
unheard of. I mean, 60 days is the norm. 35 is like a miracle.
for
And
sure.
and we're doing it in 24 hours. And so I think people will try, but unfortunately, the industry is stuck in this Henry Ford assembly line. And I'm not kidding. I mean, if you actually look at the documents, the training manuals that they have, they talk about assembly lines. Well, we haven't used assembly lines to build things at scale in quite a while. And the ones that we do don't look anything like Henry Ford's. And in particular, when we're building digital products like software, that has completely transformed. There's basically no such thing as a build test cycle that used to exist. That all happens simultaneously. That's technology that we use in now for mortgages, right? Is that we just continuously work on the mortgage 24 hours. We don't, the computer does.
Yeah.
And so that's a big unlock. So I actually hope they do, because one of the things in working with Fannie Mae and other big institutions who are buying our mortgages that they greatly appreciate, and kind of surprised us that others didn't do it. They're like, wow, all your mortgages are the same. And I'm like, well, that's because a machine does them, right? I mean, it's not up to Fred, who's having a bad day, to check the right checkbox. A
Hmm.
machine doesn't have a bad day, and so that's important. Now, where do humans come into that? Well, humans are really good at making judgment calls.
Hmm.
And so when you unburden them, you talked about the example on the selling side. Our top broker or top loan officer, his last job was throwing baseballs. He was a minor league baseball player,
Mm.
right? He doesn't need to know, quote, mortgage. He needs to know how to talk to people and help them understand this complicated stuff. The machine does all the heavy lifting for him, shows him the numbers, and then he walks the customer through it, which has a double benefit. One, he's not spending all his time on a calculator or a spreadsheet and only able to do two or three options. The system can do thousands. But as well, it allows him to focus on the human side of it, which is it's the largest financial transaction most people will make in their lives. And the ability for him to get to core thing the person's trying to solve, because people don't come to us saying I want to get a low rate. They come to us saying I want to send my kids to college, or I have a family member who's sick, I need to pay the bills, or I got this surprise that I didn't think about that I need money for. And that's the problem you're solving, not getting them the greatest rate. The goal is to get them the combined package that saves them the most money so that they can, go about their lives.
All right, this is my last question because I don't want to hog the mic from the crowd, because I definitely want to leave some time for everyone else to be able to ask questions as well. But I know you're a mentor, you're an angel investor, you're really involved in the entrepreneurial community. What is mentorship meant in your world, and why should others consider it if they're not already doing it?
So, me mentoring others or me being mentored, or both?
Both. Hmm.
Well, my dad used to say, everybody has something to teach you. I think that's 100% true. Some of those are truths and some of those are lessons. And the lessons are sometimes more interesting because people who do all kinds of things have lessons to teach you. Truths are a little bit harder and they tend to be somewhat transient, like what applied in one situation doesn't in another. So I think the best mentors I've had, and I've tried to learn how they were mentoring, have kind of focused on this idea that they're not supposed to have the answers. They're supposed to guide you to finding the best answer for you because you're the one who's in the fight. You're the one who's in the ring, not them. And I remember very distinctly, going back to the Facebook stuff, being asked, should they sell the company?
Hmm.
And I said, I don't know. And they said, well, that's your job. You're the advisor, you're the mentor. I said, actually, it's not my job. That's absolutely the wrong thing I should be doing.
Yeah.
And I said, what do you want to do? And one of them answered that I want to change the world. And I said, well, then you've already decided. He
Mm.
said, no, I haven't. So you're not going to change the world working for Yahoo.
Mm-hmm.
And, we all know how that ended up. But I think that's what a mentor does. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's the role that people played for me. It wasn't Carl, don't sell, or
Yeah.
do sell. It was, well, I mean, Ron Conway did it for me. Had an acquisition offer from Sun Microsystems and from Microsoft, and he drew a curve on the board. I'll never forget this moment. And the curve started at the top and dropped down and went back up again. Pretty simple curve. And he said, you're here right now. You haven't raised any additional money and you've got an offer for the company and you could sell it right now and you're going to make this much money and your shareholders this much money. And Microsoft's a great company, so is Sun. The product will be everywhere. So now, let's say you don't take that option. Let's say you decide to wait and raise money. The minute you do that, you fall all the way down to the bottom of the curve. And he showed like this big dip. And then, if you sold the company, you would get far less than you're going to get right now because you have to pay that money back and they expect a pretty big return. And he said, even worse, you got to crawl up the other side of that curve to get to the exact same point you are right now. That was great mentorship on Ron's part, right? Because he made it very clear to me, visually, in fact, that there was a choice to be made. And it wasn't just about the right fit of a company or whatever. It was really about that gap. And he pointed out very eloquently that that's time. That's your life. And what do you want to be doing with that time? So anyway, in that situation, we did sell the company. It was the right thing to do and ended up working out great for me and for others. But I think mentors are their job number one, either by being a mentor or being mentored. That's one of the things that I look for. And then probably the last thing that's a little bit unique about me, and I think why people like working with me, is I want to be the first phone call when things go really bad. And that's a really unusual thing to say to people. But that's the time when others don't want to do that. And Roger McNamee did that for me once. I called him. It was a really bad situation. And he was playing a gig, which Roger loves to do. And he stepped out from playing that gig. He said, hey, I'll call you right back. I got to finish up my show with Moon Alice, oddly enough, his band. He called me back like an hour later and we talked for probably an hour and a half. And I'll never forget that because it was like the worst moment. I just needed somebody to talk to and he was there. And that then I realized that that's a real mentor. When the board members won't call you back, when your co-founder won't call you back, when your parents won't call you back, I'm the person that will call you back and I'm the one who will be there to help because I've been in those situations. And it's at those darkest hours where everybody else is gone when you actually need somebody. Everybody can be around when things are great. Everybody's going to answer the phone call when you say we're being acquired for $2 billion. But when your co-founder gets arrested, that is not a phone call most VCs, investors, board members, or even advisors will answer.
That's great, and thank you for sharing that. And I want to open it up to the audience, and I want other people to be able to get in here as well, Karl, and ask you some questions. So all that I say is, before you ask a question, you definitely want to introduce yourself and say your name, so that, because again, this is being recorded, and right now we're on Twitter, so we can see it. But when this is distributed on the podcast or on the website or otherwise, people may not be able to distinguish your voice. So just say your name before your question. Who'd like to go first?
I've invited everyone up to come to the stage. So I think half the group here are listeners. So feel free just to add yourself to come speak if you want to ask a question.
All right, who wants to go first?
Well, I guess while we're waiting for others, I do have one actually. I know, Karl, you and I have talked about this, but I think it's actually really interesting. I'm actually curious, how did you actually get involved and become Facebook's first advisor, or become, an advisor to Facebook?
That's a good story. Well, it involves basically doing the right thing and hoping for the best and letting serendipity work. So I had met Sean Parker when he was at Napster and then at Plaxo. I helped him through a tough time there. And I was, quote, an advisor there. And he kept promising every month or so, he'd say, I'm going to give you shares in Plaxo. It's going to be amazing. And thank you so much and everything like that. Well, that never happened. Plaxo basically went their way, and Sean left, and I was part of helping him having a good exit there. And I thought, well, all right, I did the right thing, and he's a good guy, and I supported him and all that stuff. About 2 months later, I was sitting on the beach taking a break from my last startup because I hadn't taken a break in like 15 years. And I get a phone call, and it just, my phone keeps ringing, and I'm getting ready to go kiteboarding, which is my thing that's good for my soul and everything else. And I finally answered, and I'm like, Sean, I'm busy. I'm vacationing. He goes, you got to get on a plane and come to San Francisco. I found these guys. And I'm like, what? He goes, you got to come to San Francisco. It'll be worth it. I'll make it worth your while. I'm paying you back. So I don't know. It was one of those things where I just trusted Sean, and he was so excited. And when Sean gets that way, you listen. So I got on a plane and basically did a day trip. And the funny part of that story is that the person I was meeting with was late. And Sean kept calling me and telling me he was going to be a little bit later and a little bit later. Finally, the guy walks in in flip flops and a hoodie and looks like he's been up all night, which he had because the servers kept crashing. And it was Zuck. And he sat down and pitched me the vision for Facebook, or the Facebook at the time. And I mean, I was a biomedical engineer, he was cognitive science, and we just vibed on that whole idea of connecting, as many people as possible and allowing them to share with each other. At the time, just in colleges, right? So I remember just thinking, wow, this is it. This is the next big thing. And being just super jazzed about the opportunity. I got on the plane and flew back to, it's actually Cozumel. And by the time I landed, in my inbox was an advisor agreement for Facebook. And that's how it happened.
It's a great story. Who else wants to chime in here?
Oh, I got one, Adam. This is Magnus Carter. Hi, guys. I have a question about a more recent event that happened not so long ago. So, Karl, how did your life change and perspective change on Facebook after the blackout for 3 hours? That the whole like most of the whole Facebook went down. How did you see that, and how did your life change after that? After seeing that actually happen?
Well, I'm not quite sure which time you're talking about because that used to happen pretty often, actually. Some of the old stories from the early days were that whole entire schools would go down because each school was on one server, basically. I think there's two things that go through your head. One is you're running a service that has to be up 24/7, and that's a tremendous burden for a company, particularly given the scale that Facebook's at. The other is you realize how important the company is to people's lives. Nothing teaches you how important something is than it being gone. And, those were terrible experiences for customers and terrible experiences for the company itself. But I think taught a lesson. And startups are a lot about learning lessons. And the lesson there is that you're an integral part of people's lives. You don't get to be down. And the architecture of Facebook over the years started to reflect that more and more. I mean, there's a lot of things you can say good and bad about Facebook, but their ability to build a system that not only stays up most of the time, but also allows them to experiment and try new things relatively quickly is legendary. Before Facebook, there really wasn't a company that operated at the kind of speed and scale around social that Facebook did and does. And so when it goes down, it's a big deal. Now it's even harder, right? Because you've got multiple services. There's a very different idea behind uptime of WhatsApp, for instance, versus Instagram versus Facebook. And so, I think for me, how did it change me? Well, it made you realize how essential it was, one, and two, that the company culture early on, as you probably know, was, move fast and break things. That doesn't really work well when you have to provide a service that's 365, 24/7. And so it had to be modified to keep the servers running, keep the service flowing, keep the electricity on, so to speak, because that is the expectation is there all the time, and move fast, which is a difficult mission.
Hey, I got a question. So this is Joanna Pineda. I'm CEO and chief troublemaker at a company called Matrix Group International. We're a digital agency in Alexandria, Virginia. And this is kind of a personal question. And like, I keep listening to all these leadership, lessons. I'm in a CEO peer group and everyone says, don't be afraid to fail. And I'm like afraid to fail because if I fail, my business goes under. Now I've taken risks and I've, created new products, but I don't know. What do you think about this advice? Like, don't be afraid to fail. I mean, my company has failed at certain things, but then I wonder, am I not being bold enough? So I guess this is just kind of a personal question related to like, how do you balance the risking it all versus risking some of it versus really, going for the big goal? I don't know if I'm saying this right, but I feel like I'm kind of at a crossroads. And so that's kind of where I am.
No, it's a really good question. I think there's a couple of things that come to mind, I guess. I think it changes, right? When I left Apple, Steve said to me, he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm going to go start my own company. He's like, well, great. And he's like, this is your chance. And I'm like, what do you mean? He said, well, do you have a dog? And I said, well, no. He said, do you have kids? I said, well, no. Did you have a mortgage? Oddly enough, I said, no. He goes, Karl, you're only young enough and dumb enough to go out there and truly fuck up once. After that, people depend on you. And so I think that question is a tough one because a lot of people give the advice, don't be scared to screw up or, fail or whatever. Well, that depends. It's one thing when it's just you and you can recover or move apartments to a cheaper place or whatever, but it's quite another thing when you have other people, particularly lots of employees and their families depending on you. And so I think your risk tolerance and your risk taking has to adjust. In the early days of a startup, you can take huge risks because it's you and your co-founder or a small group of people. But as you get larger and larger, and this is the problem with larger companies, right, is that the risk you take can cause what happened more recently at Facebook, which is laying off a tremendous amount of people. And so I think it's kind of a dial. It's not a kind of one size fits all, which is often the case when people give advice like that. I think the other side of that is a friend of mine said something to me the other day. I just don't understand how you do it. I said, well, what? He's like, you're not afraid to fail. How is it that you are okay with just completely failing and you're okay with it? And I said, well, I'm not. I hate failing, but I know that's how I learn and how I grow. And sometimes, through great failure comes great opportunity. And it's often that the greatest failures are the ones that open the biggest doors and the biggest opportunities. This environment right now is a great example of that. It looks horrible. Like, how bad can it be? High interest rates. Nobody wants to give us money, blah, 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 blah. And in fact, it is a blessing because it's going to help build very, very efficient companies that can weather the storm that could be coming or survive better when things do turn around or be more profitable. And so I'm with you. I often try not to give advice like that, like, don't be afraid to fail. Well, that depends. Saying that to somebody who's got 4 kids and a mortgage and house and tuition to pay for and everything like that is far different than saying that to somebody who's just out of college and their biggest worry is paying their rent. So I get the struggle there. And personally, I've had to dial it back and forth because, as a startup person, you're expected to take big risk. And if you look at all the other analogous things, I mean, I love, the Babe Ruth thing, which is, amazing home run hitter. But if you looked at his strikeout percentage, it was horrible. Like the guy struck out a lot. And that's what startups are all about, right? Is that you're swinging for the fences. And when you do, and you do hit that ball, it can be a 10 times return. But if you don't, it can be zero. And whether or not to take that risk is a big decision. I guess the last thing on that I would say is that I think you get better over time at taking calculated risks and limiting the downside. So it's not like you don't take those big risks and potentially fail. It's just that you know how to mitigate the downside. That doesn't mean you overthink it or have 15 exit plans. It just means that you know how to make a bet. There's a good analogy for that. It's called fire bullets and then cannonballs. And the idea is basically use the smallest amount of effort and resources to figure out if you're on target. This is kind of the idea behind an MVP. And then if you are, fire a cannonball, throw everything behind it versus, firing the cannonball in 50 different directions and not hitting anything.
Let me just say, I really, really appreciate this because I've been having this crisis of, my God, am I not being bold enough? But then I am afraid to fail, but I do take risks, but they're calculated risks. And I have been worried about not being bold enough. But I do worry about the people who depend on me for their jobs and their health insurance, as an example. And it weighs on me. So I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. I think that, to follow up on that, sometimes not taking a risk is the riskiest thing to do, right? And that's another hard one that comes, which is you're like, oh, if I just pushed harder or tried a different door or whatever. And if your team is aligned with you and they understand that, it's great. I think the current environment has been tough for that because there's a lot of people who didn't sign up for that or they don't think they did. There's a really interesting thread about Twitter and Elon coming in and saying, somebody asked him about vision and where the company's going and how he's going to keep people retained and what the vision is to align the company. And he said, well, I don't know about that. We just have to be more hardcore. And he's getting a lot of flack for that. But he's right. You can't have a vision or a plan to keep people if you don't stop the bleeding. That ship is sinking and he's plugging holes as fast as he can. That's the first thing. And if people aren't around, don't want to be around for that, if they don't want to, be in the guts of that and they want a fully formed vision and alignment and everything like that, it's just not the place for them. So it's a balance.
Any other questions? I think we have time for maybe one more. If we have one last one, or we try to end at the top of the hour, keep it on point for about an hour.
Adam, may I jump in real quick and ask one?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So this is Matt Cook, Director of Agency at Mission Matters. And Karl, you mentioned early on about how you want to be the advisor that when everything goes wrong, you're that first phone call. Give us a story as to one of those occasions. What took place? What happened? Why were they calling you? And give us a little bit of a clue in there because that's a pretty important topic.
Geez, I'm trying to think of how to tell it without disclosing any of the actors or actresses. I'll give you a relatively recent one. There's a CEO that I had not talked to in quite a while. I was the first, I think, investor and advisor for the company. And that just happens over time. Like I've gotten used to this idea that as companies get bigger, they got plenty of people telling them what to do and how to do it. And he texted me, said, hey, would you have time to talk this weekend? This is on Friday. And I'm like, and I hadn't heard from him in probably 2 years. And I texted back, I'll call you right now. And so I called him, and I was right. It was dire, and he had a real issue on his hands. And so I think part of it is having that instinct to know that moment is there. Sometimes it's easy to, well, sure, I have time this weekend. I'll talk to you on Sunday. That probably would not have done any good. Well, I know it wouldn't have done any good. And so I think that those moments, and I've had those, and they're usually in a crisis mode. So I know I'm not like dancing around the edge of stories, but another one comes to mind where, it was really more of like a ethical crisis would be the right way to put it. And I think oftentimes that's when it's just somebody to talk to and be a sounding board is often super helpful. In that scenario, he or she could have easily gone the other way, right? And probably changed the trajectory of the company forever. And I think that being that voice of, reason in that moment helped a lot. So sorry, I can't give the specific ones. If I did, I'd be breaching the very responsibility that I have.
Totally understand.
Can I ask also one more question? Adam, do we still have time?
Do it, Victor. Come on.
Go for it.
Okay. Thank you. This is Victor Kostrub. I am CEO of the company Fine Designs. We're a global company. We're selling event merchandise on site at the sporting events. So we're covering about 150 events a weekend, and they are taking place all over the United States, in Europe, New Zealand, Canada, and Australia as well. So my question has to do with the teamwork, because I have a lot of people and I work with a lot of people, but my concern is always about the people's potential. And so let's assume if you're my consultant and I'm calling you to get an advice. So this is about the potential, and I know they are giving me good results, but not great results. How do I motivate them? What is it? Is it a lack of vision? Is it me personally not giving them enough example? How to be determined? How do I change the culture? What is the question like that, if you know what I mean?
No, it's a great question. We could probably spend another hour on it. I mean, I think there's two things. One is that one of the things I've learned in being a manager is people often say, well, what's your management style? And I say, well, it depends on who I'm managing, right? And I think it's important to understand what motivates that person. A lot of times you'll be surprised, right? That the thing that motivates you or other team members doesn't motivate that particular person. And so that dovetails into the second part, which I think you want to figure out what the core issue is. If it's a skill set thing, right, they just lack the skills to perform, then the question is, can they learn?
Right.
And can they learn quickly? And if that's the case, then problem solved, right? If they don't have the skills, then it's different. And they don't want to acquire them. And I remember I was talking to somebody about something similar and said, well, you're going to have to learn how to do UI design. And here are a bunch of books you can use. And they're like, well, I don't understand how I'm going to find the time at work to read those books. And I started laughing. And I said, well, I didn't say you should use your work time to do that. I said, you should learn how to do UI if you want to grow in your career and your job. That's your time, right? I mean, that's your career. Right. So there has to be ability and desire. The other is the motivation thing. And that really depends on the person. Of course, in my career, worked with a lot of people, and a couple are really unique motivation things. And I worked in a group at Apple and at Sun where there are a lot of really great people who just didn't interact well with others. And I had an employee who was very similar, and we just could not get the guy motivated. And I tried everything, and I was getting frustrated, as were other people on the management team. He was getting more and more angry and resistant, and not just to me, but to others, and really bringing the team down. And I finally told him, I said, I'm going to tell you a story about a guy I used to work with. And he used to go to his office every day, and nobody would talk to him. Nobody would talk to him because he was that mean old curmudgeon-y guy that never had anything nice to say, good to say, or positive. And, he was a well-respected engineer, and he did great. He got paid a lot of money. He built a lot of great stuff. And I said, you are on your path to being that guy. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, do you want to be that guy?
Right.
And he looked at me shocked and said, no, of course not. I said, well, you got to start today. And he did. He turned completely around. He's one of our best engineers by far. And, he's not a happy-go-lucky person. That's just not his way. But, he doesn't bring the team down and be overly negative in an environment like a startup, which it can affect everybody's performance, including his own.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And just want to say, I'm so impressed to hear all of the stories that you are sharing with us and knowing your experience that you work with such a tremendous people. This is so great. And I became part of this special family of Mission Matters and working with Adam, Chirag, Matt. It's just great opportunity for me as well to grow. And as I realize, even in my age, even in my stage where I already grew the company, it all depends how much desire I still have to grow, whether I'm still hungry to grow. And that's how much I can improve, I guess, in this way, looking at this way.
Yeah, I agree. We're all lifelong learners, or we should be. And I'm still learning. And that's part of the reason I keep doing it, right? Is that every day I get taught new lessons. I think we all got taught new lessons this week in the crypto space. So.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, Karl, of course, thank you for coming on here. And it's been a pleasure. And Chirag, I'll let you do the formal closing, of course, and the thank yous.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again, Karl. Appreciate all of the stories. I know everyone here has learned quite a bit. The beautiful thing is these conversations are recorded. So this will be going live on our podcast channels, our social channels, our website, all across the board. We'll be sharing it with everyone, including you, of course, once it does go live. And just want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Again, we host these conversations once a week. And, we're going to host another dialogue next week, Thursday, 4 p.m. PST. So looking forward to having all of you join us once again. And with that, I hope you all have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you, Karl. Thank you, guys.